This video was brought to you by Brilliant. Over the past few weeks, pro-Palestine encampments at American universities have made headlines all over the world, and at the heart of this debate is the issue of divestment. Since the 1980s, US universities have pivoted away from education towards profit, directing billions of dollars of endowments towards risky and ethically dubious investment strategies that don't always even pay off. At the same time, increasing numbers of financial professionals are being given seats on university leadership boards, with 56% of board leadership positions at research universities and 44% at liberal arts universities coming from the financial sector. So in this video, we'll take a look at how US universities became glorified hedge funds, some of the issues associated with this, and whether anything will change. If you haven't already, consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. But first, let's start with some context. There are two main types of universities in the US: private universities, which we'll focus on in this video, and public universities. Now, both types of universities get funding from students' tuition fees, but while public universities get direct funding from the state and federal sources, private universities don't. And over the decades, an increasing share of their income has come from alumni donations that often then get put in endowment funds. To be clear, US university endowments are unbelievably massive, with most worth more than $1 billion, and the biggest, Harvard, is worth more than $50 billion, which is more than the total GDP of 120 countries. Now, what's important here is that the average share of US university budgets coming from endowments has skyrocketed over the years, as universities started to be run as profit-generating businesses. And to understand how this happened, we've got to explain the Yale model. From 1985 until his death in 2021, Yale had a chief investment officer called David Swensen, who pioneered an endowment model that involved shifting investment from boring stuff, like government bonds, to slightly funkier investments, i.e. volatile but high-yield assets like private equity, hedge funds, real estate, and emerging markets. Now, initially, this worked well, with the Yale endowment seeing an astonishingly impressive annual average return of 11.8% between 1999 and 2009. And consequently, other Ivy League universities like Harvard, MIT, and Princeton adopted the same model. However, these high-risk investments were vulnerable to the 2008 financial crash, which battered university endowments. Harvard endowment dropped by a record 30%, forcing the university to lay off 275 staff. And a 2010 report by Harvard academics at the Telus Institute declared Swensen's endowment model to be broken. And today, there are basically two popular criticisms regarding the hedge fundification of American unis. Firstly, that too much money is being invested in financial assets and not enough is being spent on students and education, which is what universities should really be about. And secondly, that the money is being invested in dodgy companies and therefore should be divested. Let's start with the first issue, that the money being generated from these investments isn't really being spent on students. And in fact, more of it is apparently being spent on hedge fund fees. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, hedge funds take a hefty fee, generally about 2% of assets, for their services. And a report from 2015 estimated that $2.5 billion was paid in hedge fund fees from university endowments. In fact, university endowments spend nearly 3 times as much on hedge fund and private equity fees than they did on scholarships. And even of the money they are spending on students, a 2022 working paper from economist George Bullman found that spending of endowment profits on student aid was statistically insignificant. Since the average US student graduates with some $30,000 worth of student debt, the hedge fundification of universities has understandably led some irritation, and critics have likened the process to hoarding, with universities sitting on huge piles of cash while simultaneously squeezing students and academics dry. Now, American universities might be able to justify these practices if they were indeed making amazing returns and then spending it on students. But this doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, a recent paper published by investor analyst Richard Ennis called the long-term returns of these supposedly sophisticated endowments unexceptional, and found that the average US university endowment basically underperformed the market in 12 of the past 15 years. Weak returns and expensive fees mean that endowments paid 60 cents to hedge fund managers for every dollar of return on these investments over this period. It's not just that they're ineffective, there's also the super topical issue of divestment. Right now, students across the Western world are calling for greater transparency about universities' investments. Now, companies profiting from Israel's war in Gaza are obviously the focus of attention right now, but students have historically also campaigned for universities to cut financial ties with fossil fuel producers, weapons manufacturers, tobacco companies, and prison firms, often in tandem with the boycott, divest, and sanctions movement. Now, universities often resist divestment calls on financial grounds, claiming that their investments are maximizing returns, which means more money for the university. But the reality is, as we've just mentioned, most of these investment strategies aren't paying huge dividends to anyone other than hedge fund managers themselves, so they might be better off just leaving it all in an index fund. On top of this, there's a related issue regarding the amount of institutional control being given over to ultra-wealthy hedge fund managers, which in turn can impact academic freedom. There's long been a gag that elite schools have become hedge funds with universities attached, and we can now see this in the increasing number of university board seats being given to financial professionals, which gives them even more influence over universities' decision-making. You can clearly see this happening across the US, where big donors have threatened to withdraw their support to leverage the administration. In fact, just back in January, the billionaire Harvard alumnus and hedge fund manager Ken Griffin halted donations to Harvard, the University of Pennsylvania, Columbia, and others, claiming that the elite schools were producing, quote, whiny snowflakes, and said last week that the current chaos in US campuses was the product of a cultural revolution. Griffin was also one of a group of major donors alleged to have pressured Harvard's president, Claudine Gay, into stepping down a few months ago, after she resisted calls to condemn anti-Israel demonstrations. So, with renewed calls for divestment and more literature coming through on the impacts of this hedge fundification, is anything likely to change? Well, in the last few days, some US universities have made tentative promises to consider divestment and greater transparency around their endowments in the future, while others, such as Brown, Northwestern, and the University of Minnesota, have begun increasing opportunities for students to be involved in discussions around endowments. Whether greater student input can reverse the trend of more endowments going into investments is yet to be seen. But if it does, this could be great news for anyone who thinks that universities should focus on teaching, which is what they're good at, rather than investing, which is something that they're apparently not good at. Ultimately underpinning this topic is a lot of data, whether that's economics, trade patterns, polling, or demographics. A lot of the time with politics, you just have to understand the data. So if you want to get a better grasp on these kind of things, I'd recommend Brilliant. And they've just introduced a whole bunch of new data courses, which are perfect for learners of any level, taking you through everything from Bayes' theorem to multiple linear regression. It even uses real data sets from the likes of Starbucks, X, and Spotify in order to bring things to life. I'm not even a super mathematical person, and I still found it easy and enjoyable to work through. And that's because of how Brilliant is designed, built around learning by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data analysis, programming, and AI. The good thing is that, like I mentioned earlier, you can learn all of these things quickly and easily because Brilliant's courses are split into easy-to-digest chunks. Brilliant helps you build real knowledge in just minutes a day, with fun lessons that you can do whenever you have time, replacing mindless scrolling on the train or while waiting for coffee with something actually stimulating and rewarding. So get learning across all kinds of STEM subjects for free for a full 30 days by clicking the link in the description. That way you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription, and they'll know that you came from us, which really helps us out.